everyone. Today we are going to be talking about hormones. So I know this is a very popular topic for both men and women, and I'm going to clarify why it's important also for men to be listening to this conversation. But because hormones is such a big topic, I'm really going to focus today around estrogen specifically. So anybody listening, women, do you struggle with painful cramping around your menstrual cycle or PMS that leaves you feeling either like overly weepy or depressed or maybe irritable? How about acne? Do you tend to break out around the menstrual cycle or just have acne, persistent acne in general? It could be on the face, it could be on the chest, it could be on the back. Do you struggle with weight gain or inability to lose weight? Are you one of those women, I used to be this way, are you one of those women where you gain like 5 pounds of water weight before your menstrual cycle? Or maybe you're menopausal and you can't get, like your metabolism has changed. You can't get rid of the stubborn belly fat. Men now, I know you probably see the word estrogen, you're like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, I'm gonna keep scrolling, but I'll stop you right there because it does. So men, do you struggle with low libido or changes in performance? Have you noticed more emotional tendencies like weepy tendencies or depression, lack of motivation and drive? Have you noticed an increase in stubborn belly fat that you can't get rid of? How about changes in energy or gynecomastia, the formation of male breasts? Has your doctor told you that your prostate is enlarged? Do you struggle with acne? So, like I said, this fits across the board for both men and women. And what we're talking about, what the central theme is the hormone estrogen. So, I think we can all appreciate that estrogen is pivotal. It's a pivotal hormone in both men and women. Yes, it is more abundant in women naturally. Conversely, testosterone is more abundant in men naturally. But nonetheless, both sexes employ both hormones, and both are very important for both sexes. So estrogen is a steroid hormone, which means it's created from a cholesterol backbone. It's synthesized by both the ovaries, the testes, and the adrenal glands. And it provides in women, it's one of our predominant hormones. So what I mean by that is estrogen and progesterone are our two most predominant steroid hormones. And men, I'm gonna speak to you in just a minute. So another thing that I want to mention before we get into this is the name of the game with hormones. Let's first talk about what hormones are. Hormones are chemical messengers. So the brain, the nervous system controls almost everything. And it does so through two main pathways, nerves and hormones. So nerves are electrical messengers, right? It can travel at 270 miles per hour. The message is sent almost instantaneously. Hormones, on the other hand, are chemical messengers. So we release hormones from glands in response to signals from, not exclusively, there are some exceptions to this, but when we're talking about estrogen, we release it largely in response to chemicals from the brain. It's also important to note that two big things when we're talking about estrogen in particular. One, fat cells can produce estrogen. This is independent of our normal brain-based production. So fat cells in men and women produce estrogen. The second thing is our environment is surrounded with estrogen. It's called xenoestrogen. So it's in a form, it's a chemical that the chemical structure mimics our own endogenous or self-made estrogen. This really gained headlines way back, probably close to 20 years ago at this point, when Nalgene water bottles, if you remember this, Nalgene water bottles were brought under scrutiny for containing BPA, a toxic chemical that's found in many different kinds of plastics. And BPA is one of those examples because BPA chemically is very similar to estrogen. We refer to these as xenoestrogens, chemicals that mimic estrogen. And BPA is not only found in different plastics that are still in use, but it's also found in receipt paper. You can find estrogen from birth control metabolites that are found in our drinking water and tap water. Estrogen, the most common herbicide that is used on the market today is a xenoestrogen. So that's what I mean by it's ubiquitous in our environment. So now that we understand the two different sources of estrogen, there's endogenous, to repeat that, there's endogenous, which is our own production. We produce it, men and women produce it from the ovaries, the adrenal glands, and the testes, as well as fat cells. So there's our own endogenous production. There's also exogenous, which is from the environment. Estrogen, chemically derived, or just naturally taken, like in birth control pills, for example, forms of estrogen that come from outside of the body. Now, the name of the game with hormones is whether you make it or you're exposed to it from the environment, you want to use it and then lose it. So what I mean by that is it goes through, it inerts all of its biochemical pathways, biochemical processes, and then we detoxify it. And that is a very important component here too. So estrogen is largely detoxified through the glucuronidation pathway, to some degree sulfation pathway also in the liver. And it goes through phase 1 and phase 2 in the liver. And glucuronidation, sulfation means it's bound to a protein. And then once it's through, metabolized, deconjugated through the liver, it passes through the gallbladder and it dumps into the intestines, where then we're supposed to eliminate it in our stool. A very small amount we recycle, just like we recycle bile, we recycle cholesterol, we recycle vitamins, we try to recycle things when we can, but most of it we want to lose it. And that's another important component to remember with this too. So now let's talk about when this system goes wrong. First, starting with women. It's very important to know, women, we are supposed to have a healthy ratio between our two predominant sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And I'm speaking largely to menstruating women, but this applies to menopausal women as well. So healthy ratio, estrogen, progesterone. Estrogen is a very proliferative, active hormone. It's energizing, it's an active hormone, kind of conceptually. Progesterone, on the other hand, is very calming and nourishing. It's our hormone that gets the uterus ready for egg implantation should an egg be fertilized. So it's very calming and nourishing. Especially from a mood perspective, progesterone is a very calming, anti-anxiety, some sedative properties. So like I said, we want that in an ideal ratio. But what can often happen is, and this is where, anybody, when I was talking about the symptoms of like, can you not lose weight? Do you have painful menstrual cycles? Did you have a really horrendous transition into menopause? Something that we'll often see is what we refer to as estrogen dominance. And what that means in women, that can manifest in two different ways. One is where there's too much estrogen. So progesterone levels are normal, but there's too much estrogen. And that can happen from a variety of factors. One is, well, actually, let me finish this example. So estrogen dominance in women manifests as either too much estrogen to normal progesterone, or it can be normal estrogen and low progesterone. Very similar clinical manifestations, very different approach on what we do to restore it. And I'm not going to go into depth about the normal estrogen, low progesterone. All I'm going to say about that is that's what makes testing very important, because like I said, they're two totally different approaches, even though the symptoms often overlap. So when looking at too much estrogen, first question is why? Why is there too much estrogen? Well, that's where we have to look at what does your body's production look like, and are you exposed to it from the environment? So body's production. If there's too much, we have to ask, are you making too much? So for example, are there abnormalities in the sex hormones? Are you actually making too much? Is there excessive fat? So if there's too much fat in women, we will produce, those fat cells produce estrogen. Could it be stress? So transient stress temporarily as DHEA and cortisol and all these other hormones are elevated, we'll also see a concurrent rise in sex hormones. Now, please keep in mind this won't last forever, and eventually the sex hormones will fall, but initially there could be higher levels. We also need to look at how are you detoxing. So how do you detox the estrogen once you're finished using it? This requires B vitamins, this requires amino acids, this requires certain chemicals that can be found in food, like sulforaphane, for example, or calcium D-glucarate are different examples that can be found in cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower, kale, but those support the pathways in the liver. Do you have healthy bile flow and a gallbladder and healthy bile output? And then also looking at it from the intestinal perspective, are you having at least 2 bowel movements per day? If you're not, that can be considered constipation, and you can have a higher tendency to reabsorb excessive amounts of the estrogen. In addition, it also suggests that there might be gut dysbiosis. And when there's gut dysbiosis, these microbes can form an enzyme that actually perpetuates reabsorption of estrogen. We call this the estrobolome. There's actually bacteria that directly impact our hormone levels. And so they do so through producing excessive amounts of that enzyme that allow for estrogen reabsorption. So those are the endogenous sources of high estrogen. Exogenous, again with women specifically, we look at things like birth control. Are you taking birth control? That can lead to too much estrogen, especially because birth control depletes our B vitamins in the liver. So then we have a hindered ability to detoxify it. You want to look at plastics. So plastics like Tupperware or water bottles, or those are some of the 2 biggest sources, but plastics in general can be sources of xenoestrogens. You touch receipt paper, things along those lines. And then the third one is personal care products. So xenoestrogens are also commonly found in personal care products. Parabens, for example, phthalates, both of these are very common additives, preservatives that are found in personal care products that are xenoestrogens. Non-organic food. I mentioned that the most abundant, the most common herbicide is a xenoestrogen that's found in non-organic food. So those are some of the, and non-organic animal products. To give you an idea of the effects, just a very easy to see effects of estrogen, specifically on weight, look at the cattle industry. So it's very well known that high estrogen causes weight gain. And because of this, cows, like conventionally raised cows, are actually given estrogen to fatten them up quicker. So of course that also becomes an exogenous source of estrogen when we eat it. Dairy products, things along those lines. So those are the exogenous sources. Now, what can happen, as I mentioned, is when there's too much estrogen, that there's a whole host of effects that can happen, but like looking at the immune system and histamine and many other things. But nonetheless, what most commonly manifests is the heavy cramping, very heavy menstrual cycles, hot flashes, weight gain in menopause, mood changes in menopause, PMS type mood changes in menstruating women. We'll see difficulty losing weight gain around the menstrual cycle, but then also difficulty losing weight, breast swelling and tenderness, acne on the face, the chest, the back. So these are some examples of the symptoms that we see. And it becomes very important to help safely detoxify this estrogen. Keyword there being safely also, because there's actually 3 different routes of detoxification that estrogen can go. And I don't want to get too techie on you, but 2 of them are safe. They're safely detoxified forms of estrogen. One of them creates a more carcinogenic form of estrogen. And when the detox route is prioritizing that pathway, that's where we can start to see associations between hormonally driven pathology. So hormonally driven cancers like breast cancer, for example, cervical cancer, uterine cancer. We also see with high estrogen across the board, but especially if we're detoxing it down this unsafe route, we'll also see uterine fibroids, polycystic ovarian syndrome, endometriosis. So we'll see other pathologies associated with the high estrogen. It's also worth mentioning too that estrogen, from another hormonal perspective, high estrogen will bind up thyroid protein. So it actually starts to mimic hypothyroidism. When your thyroid is okay, it's fine, but the thyroid hormone is being bound up by these hormonal binding globulins associated with the high estrogen, leading to symptoms and manifestations of hypothyroidism. There are ways that we can actually look at that when the appropriate thyroid tests are run on blood tests. And then it's also worth mentioning too that there's an association with cholecystitis, so gallbladder sludge or gallbladder inflammation associated with high levels of estrogen, because that high estrogen puts an added weight on the detox and on the liver and on gallbladder detoxification. And so we'll see the sludge, we'll see gallbladder inflammation. And someone when report their experience of that. They say I become constipated or I get diarrhea around my menstrual cycle, for example. And sometimes that's where we'll see that correlation. So that's the story around high estrogen, kind of in a nutshell, high estrogen for women, both menopausal and menstruating women. In men, this manifests differently, obviously. But men will still be able to relate. So men, if you're struggling with low testosterone, listen closely to this. If you're struggling with low testosterone, it is critical that you check estrogen levels first, because there's an enzyme called aromatase, and that enzyme converts testosterone into estrogen. So you might be producing testosterone okay, especially if you're a 30-year-old male listening to this. You might be producing testosterone okay, but it's all being converted into estrogen. Now, why, right? What is the factor that drives that? There's a few different reasons, but one of the factors I see most commonly is blood sugar issues. So men, dysglycemia, blood sugar imbalances. So if your blood sugar is doing this all day, or if it's staying high, if you've been diagnosed pre-diabetic or diabetic, or if you can even relate to these symptoms, you become hangry, irritable, tired after going prolonged periods without eating. Do you crave sugar? Are you gaining weight or have a difficult time losing weight? Those can be some examples of dysglycemia, kind of easy examples of dysglycemia. The reason I say that is because blood sugar swings or high blood sugar activate that enzyme. So you'll be converting your testosterone into estrogen more readily when there's blood sugar swings. Okay. Nutrient deficiencies can do this too. Zinc is needed for proper aromatase activity, for example. Thyroid issues in men can do this. Liver issues can do this. But nonetheless, so we're talking about endogenous production specifically. And then also in men, fat cells still produce estrogen. So just like they do in women, fat cells in men will also produce estrogen. So if there's just an excessive amount of adipose tissue, there can be a coinciding elevation in estrogen in men too. So as I said, there might be low testosterone, but that doesn't mean just provide more testosterone, because it might be converted into estrogen. So that's why it's important to check both. In addition, men, if you experience gynecomastia, so the formation of male breasts, that is a dead giveaway that there's too much estrogen. That's where that's coming from. And for men also, the exogenous sources are the same. So obviously you're not taking birth control, or you're not going to be taking hormone replacement therapy specifically in the form of estrogen. But if you're taking testosterone, you'll definitely want to look in on this and make sure that your doctor is testing estrogen. However, the environmental factors, so non-organic food, plastics, and tap water, all stand the same, just like in women. And men also, a couple other things to mention. What I'll often see in men that have high estrogen levels is not only often gynecomastia, sometimes belly fat, inability to lose weight around the midsection. Mood changes are another big one. So lack of motivation and drive, lack of pursuit, lack of that kind of aggressive male dominant trait. We'll also see more emotional, so like weepiness, depression, All of this looks at the role that, of testosterone too. And then prostate issues. So I mentioned how this can affect the ovaries, the uterus in women, and men. Enlarged prostate can have a direct association with estrogen levels. So in other words, safely supporting the detoxification of estrogen and eliminating sources of xenoestrogens in your environment can save your prostate. This is really big. So, like I said, different ways that it can show up, but really wanting to point out the importance of looking at and considering estrogen levels. So next, what do we do about it? First step is testing. There's 3 different ways that hormones can be tested. Some are better than others. Most common way is a blood test. And I should clarify first by saying there's actually 3 different types of estrogen, believe it or not. We use one word, but estrogen refers to 3 different hormones. There's estrone, which is most predominant in menopausal women. It's a weaker estrogen, but most predominant in menopausal women. There's estradiol. That is the most abundant in both men and women, and it's in premenopausal women, and it's the most potent form of estrogen. And then there's estriol, which is more so associated with pregnancy, but it's also, and it's one of the weakest forms of estrogen, but it's also one of the routes that estrogen is detoxed. So estrone and estradiol can be converted into estriol before it's converted down this other pathway that gets rid of it. So I bring that up because blood testing will most commonly look at estradiol. And this is appropriate for men and women. I personally am not a really big fan of blood testing for hormones, unless it's thyroid or insulin, but for sex hormones, I'm not a big fan. It is the most common. I still support it. I look at those records all the time. The only reason I say that is because that just shows a snapshot of the amount of the hormone in the time of the blood at the time of the blood draw. It's also not showing what's actually in the tissue doing work. So less sensitive, but nonetheless, it's still a snapshot, still an option. Second option is salivary hormone testing. And salivary hormone testing looks at the amount of the free hormone that's in the tissue at the time of the sample. And we can, depending on how it's collected, we can get a better idea over 30 days or over the course of a day, and you average those levels together. I often use salivary testing, I often use salivary testing. So that's an option. And then the third option is urinary testing. And the only method that I would support for this is a very specific urinary test called the Dutch test. It's actually dried urine. That's what Dutch stands for, dried urine test comprehensive hormones. And the method by which they go through that, we're actually looking at estrogen metabolites, but we can see still all 3 types of estrogen metabolites, and this test in particular provides tons of information about how you're detoxifying it, the ratios of the other hormones, nutrients that are involved in detoxifying, so we can get a better idea, if estrogen does come back high, we can pinpoint somewhere else in the process what's causing it to be high. So the Dutch test is like the cream of the crop, the most information that you can get. Saliva is great. I'll often use saliva for just checking in on hormones in general. They don't have any overt pathology associated with hormones or history of it. But the women that have some PMS here and there, or the men that are experiencing some changes in mood, or things along those lines. And then blood testing, I'll most commonly look over if their doctor has tested it through blood. So those are the methods of testing, and I highly, highly, highly recommend testing not just estrogen, but all of the hormones, looking at cortisol, looking at DHEA, progesterone, testosterone, because they really do work as a constellation. And so you have to look at what all of them are doing and the balance and their interactions. Once you've identified, in this case, we're still keeping the focus on high estrogen. Once you've identified the high estrogen, then you go about evaluate the environment. Are there, non-organic food, plastics, etc. Evaluate the environment, but then we look into supporting detoxification of the estrogen. So some of the favorite ways that we can do this. One, B complex vitamins. So B vitamins are needed to support detoxification in the liver, first and foremost, of many things, but especially of the hormones. B vitamins. Second is indole-3 carbinol. This is an extract that you get from broccoli, and you can concentrate it so that you're getting therapeutic doses of that nutrient. You can also eat a lot of cruciferous vegetables. I mean, cruciferous vegetables are great for many different reasons. Broccoli, cauliflower, kale, bok choy, things along those lines, Brussels sprouts. They'll naturally contain it. Broccoli sprouts are a great source of indole-3 carbinol, but nonetheless, you can also supplement with it, and that helps safely detoxify estrogen through that preferred route, and the safe route I mentioned before. And then there is calcium D-glucarate. And calcium D-glucarate, I mentioned that estrogen's detoxified through the glucuronidation pathway in the liver. Calcium D-glucarate is a protein that binds to the estrogen. You can think of it like a passenger in a taxi cab, and then it shuttles it out of the liver and into the stool where it's been safely eliminated. And what happens, I mentioned that gut bacteria can produce an enzyme that promotes estrogen reabsorption, and that's the complex that it's working on, is the gut bacteria produce an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase that cleaves, it basically pulls the passenger out of the taxi cab, right? So it cleaves the estrogen glucarate bond, and that's what allows the reabsorption. So calcium D-glucarate not only supports in the liver, it also supports safe excretion through the gut. There's a lot more I could say about that as far as, gut dysbiosis and integrity and things along those lines, but we'll just keep it simple for this conversation. And then minerals are really important. Antioxidants are really important. Essential fatty acids are really important. So there's a lot of other components to consider with this. But I just wanted to mention some of the key ones. If I see someone come back with high estrogen, these are the ones that I'm definitely including. And then, of course, like I said before, identify what the sources are. One more thing that's worth mentioning, because this speaks to a lot of the people that I work with, is there are different types of mold that can also mimic estrogen. And I'll see this, I've seen this before, where somebody has uterine fibroids or ovarian fibroids or cysts, and there's mold toxicity associated with it. So in that case, you can still support estrogen detoxification, but it becomes really critical to also address the mold. Cool. I think that covers it. Last thing I'll mention, actually two more things. One would be the benefit of activated charcoal as a supplement. You can take that. Not only will that support bile and binding up other toxins, but it will support safe elimination of the estrogen as well. And then last thing to consider, I would highly recommend filtered water. So even something, the brand that I love the most is Berkey, Berkey. It's a home system. You can just get a countertop. It's not too expensive, but it filters out like 99% of contaminants, including the hormones. So filtered water would be big. And then organic food for sure, especially animal products. Organic food though. And if you use plastic Tupperware, start to phase it out and get rid of it. Especially never put anything hot, fatty, or acidic in that plastic Tupperware, because that enhances the leaching of those chemicals. So instead you can switch to glass. There's glass Tupperware. It's all over the place now. You can find them for really inexpensively on Amazon. Costco used to sell them, but the glass is much safer and cleaner. All right. So I think that covers everything. We talked about estrogen, the role that estrogen plays as a sex hormone in both men and women. We talked about sources of estrogen, our own endogenous production coming from our own body, or exogenous production coming from the environment. We talked about problems for both men and women associated with too much estrogen, both symptoms as well as diagnosable conditions. And then we talked about how to test for hormones, estrogen, and how to safely promote the safe detoxification of estrogen. All right, everyone. I hope that helps. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.